Welcome to IEC, Becoming an Engineer, where we connect engineering education research with real-world practice, academia, and industry. Our goal is to create an inclusive space for dialogue, collaboration, knowledge sharing across the engineering education sector in South Africa, positioning our unique challenges and innovations as a key voice in the global engineering education conversation. We explore the challenges and opportunities of engineering education in the global South, while linking our experiences to the broader international landscape. Whether you're an academic, industry professional, or a student curious about engineering education and its meaning for your future, this podcast offers meaningful discussions that go beyond research papers to unpack practical strategies for positive change in engineering education spaces. Join us as we bring together diverse voices, bridge some perspectives, and reimagine engineering education for a more connected and impactful future. Today's guest is Professor Zach Simpson, who's a leading voice in the engineering education space that began in educational linguistics and has then moved somewhat into the world of engineering education. Zach is an associate professor at the University of Johannesburg, and he's been working as an educational developer in their Faculty of Engineering in the built environment, exploring things like engineering's evolving nature as a discourse, how academics develop their practices in higher education, and the complexities of curriculum practices. Zach is also the editor-in-chief of SOTL in the South, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, for those who aren't familiar. And this is a journal dedicated to scholarship of teaching and learning from and about the global South, so Africa, Asia, South America.
So, Ruben, I think what really stood out for me in Zach's conversation, he really talks a lot about how we communicate in different spaces, especially in his own journey, coming from a humanities background and moving into engineering from a language perspective and trying to unpack how we are communicating, even though we're using the same words. There's often a disconnect because in engineering there's a visual, a graphic element of the communication as well. And just his journey in becoming so interested and invested in trying to understand both sides of the languages so he can bridge that divide. That was actually really interesting for me because I find in communication with others that's outside of engineering, especially if it's researchers outside of the field, if we're thinking about research and engineering education, it's really difficult to make that transition if both sides are not open to learn the language.
I'm reminded about how often communication is not just what we say, sometimes in very, very dense words, but also what we're not saying, that we assume that the people we're communicating with will understand or take implicitly. I experience this a lot when I'm sitting in a presentation by people who are mathematicians, where I know enough to be kind of keeping up with what's going on, but they'll say something. I was like, God, what are they talking about now? And layered on top of that, these ideas of who feels they can speak in a space, right? Yeah, the who do we respond to? Who do we not respond to? And as lecturers, our behavior around those things has quite significant ripples in our classrooms. So Zach highlighting these ideas around how do we communicate when we draw. You and I both come from a classical mechanical engineering background. So if I draw something and I only draw half the shaft with the center line, we're both trained to know that is a cylindrical axisymmetric thing, and you're not drawing other stuff because it's the symmetry is implied by literally how I draw one line on that drawing. We share that background around communication, yet every time I have a student in my class who might not have taken that same drawing course, and I do that, it's not wrong that I have to explain to them what it is. Or the students who've forgotten. Yeah, so the insights and the thought about, like, what are we actually trying to communicate? Who are we communicating it to? What is the shared language? Students don't have all of the vocabulary that we want them to have. That's why they're students. So thinking about where will they struggle with things that we communicate that we want them to grow into, super important to everything that we do as engineering educators. Zach, it's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Zach, we'd like to begin with a little bit about your personal journey and how your background and experiences um, in your own studies and then postgraduate and early career have shaped your research in engineering education.
Thanks, Ruben. My journey into engineering education started, I think, actually, when I first entered university, where I realized that not everyone experiences the university as a welcoming environment. And I came to this realization when I started working as a language tutor at the university. And I realized that a lot of the sort of discursive or linguistic practices that I took for granted and that seemed so simple to me were really not transparent or apparent to other students. And that started me thinking about what makes higher education such complicated space for students from diverse backgrounds. And so that led me into coordinating the Writing Center at the University of Johannesburg. And it was during that time that I was approached by the engineering faculty to teach a communication module in that faculty, but then also to offer some input and advice as to how to develop teaching and learning in the faculty. Initially, it was very much focused on how to develop the language practices of students in engineering, but subsequently, my role has expanded to include teaching and learning more broadly. So I entered the engineering education space initially when I was very young, actually, and my main role was to teach communication and social science courses to engineers, and then, as I say, to give input into questions of how to build the development of writing and communication skills into the curriculum. When I entered the engineering faculty, it didn't take long before I realized that it's quite difficult to speak to engineers, not necessarily because there's something wrong with them, but because they speak such a unique language. And even myself, let alone students, but even myself, really struggled to access the particular ways of speaking and thinking and representing things that were being privileged in engineering. And so that led me to actually do a PhD in which I investigated that specific question, where I looked at how engineering students come to make meaning and represent their understandings and their knowledge in engineering specific ways. So through drawing, through mathematical notation, through diagrams, and so on and so forth. And so that's how I entered the engineering education research space.
I think the challenges that you've highlighted about how do engineers engage, and that if I think about my own career, how at times with colleagues I could just draw a couple of lines on a page, and that was enough to them. But everybody else in the group went, "What are these squiggles? What are you two talking about?" Right? So, and definitely with some hindsight and perspective, one can understand the massive challenge of teaching communication to engineers. So, so that's kind of brought you along, and how has that influenced kind of where you are in engineering education today? What are some of the topics that you're currently into in that engineering education space?
So I think the first thing is after finishing my PhD, a particular challenge that I faced was the fact that my role increasingly required of me to work with other engineering lecturers to develop their own teaching and learning practices. It meant that I had to really respond to what their interests were and their needs were. And so it also meant that as over the last decade or so, there's been an increasing value placed on scholarship of teaching and learning, or SOTL. And particularly at my institution, there is a large value placed on SOTL. So that meant that a lot of my colleagues wanted to develop their teaching and learning practices, but also wanted to produce subtle research. And that meant that because each of them had very specific challenges that they were dealing with in their class, we had to try and find easily accessible theories that could be productive, because I'm a firm believer that theory should be useful and not just theory. For me should never be the object of inquiry itself. It should be useful for looking at something specific. And so we had to find theories that were really useful, but also quite accessible for people that didn't necessarily have a background in educational research. And so that the shifting of colleagues from being solely engineers to being engineering education researchers ultimately, although via sort of the avenue of SOTL, or Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, was really difficult to navigate. And also for me, it was difficult to navigate because it meant that I had to get on top of a lot of different theories and sort of different approaches. So at one stage, when I first started, I used communities of practice a lot because I was quite familiar with it and I thought it was probably quite nicely accessible to others and they could see how it could apply to engineering as a community of practice. And then we also moved into things like action research. So that was a challenge that initially arose when dealing with developing engineering education at faculty level and developing engineering lecturers as teachers. So I think that what that has done is that it's given me an appreciation of the fact that educational research is very complex, and it's just like when I first entered engineering, I was confused by the discourses that I was faced with coming at me from the engineers. So too have I seen engineers really switch off when they are confronted with these educational discourses that are to them just as strange and incoherent. And so I think that was one of the core learnings that I had to come to. A second implication of all of this is this belief that theory is only useful insofar as it is useful, and that you do a disservice to the teaching and learning if the theory becomes the object of focus rather than what it is useful to explain or to describe in the teaching and learning. So I think those are the two primary learnings that that my experiences of entering into engineering education and then working in the field for the last decade or so have sort of brought me to.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Zach. I think there's so many connection points that I'm picking up for me. I think if I think about where you started talking about how do we actually develop communication in engineering? I mean, there's a component of the actual communication, and then there's the discourse of the profession that is really complicated. And I think when you're sitting in the profession, if you're in industry and this is the way you talk and this is the way you identify, it's often not so easy for someone either in the profession or in higher education to break it down to a granular level to then see how that identity formation happens in the student. And I think what's really interesting, you're leading then the work also to say that it's almost like that's some of the questions that you try to answer, and then leading into, well, now we actually need to look at the academics, which I find really fascinating. I think in our previous episode with Professor Karen Wolf, I think that also came up as a theme in terms of it's almost like when you go into practice, a lot of the educational aspects take you back to who are the academics and how does what you do in a research context serve them, and how can they in their practice find a different way of being. Because I wonder if you think about this, because in fact there's a development of becoming an engineer. There's also the development of becoming a teacher, I want to say, like a vocational aspect to the academic development component, which it sounds like a big part of your work has influenced in that way, and a lot of your experience has been in that space. So I'm wondering around that notion of you're basically becoming the guide for engineering academics. So crossing that, I guess, speaking both languages in order to enable them to also become more than just an engineer, but someone that can develop other engineers?
Yes, I think I agree with you. So I think in my experience, when I started out, it was about making the ways in which engineers communicate. And by communicate, I don't just mean speak to each other. I mean how they represent what it is that they know. So a lot of the initial stuff was about how do we make that explicit? That in itself is a challenge because once you've become once you've achieved mastery of a particular way of thinking or communicating, you actually no longer really are consciously aware of the fact that you are doing that. It becomes part of your nature. So in the first instance, it was about sort of unpacking how it is that people come to make meaning like an engineer. And that was really the impetus behind my PhD research. But then, as you say, it parallels with teaching and learning, because so often people have taken for granted and often implicit assumptions about teaching and learning. And they either teach the way that they themselves were taught, or they have quite narrow views of teaching and learning. And so what this means is that you not only have to think about the ways in which you come to make meaning as a engineer, but you also need to think about the ways in which you come to make meaning as a teacher in the classroom, and how you can coordinate the various resources that you have available to you in the classroom, that being as basic as your own voice and body, but also then your PowerPoints and your other technologies that exist in the classroom, as well as then sort of online learning tools and so on. So how does one coordinate all of these different resources in the classroom to actually construct meaning for students, but then also to allow students to construct meaning for themselves? And so that then takes you into sort of notions of assessment. Yes, I think that you're absolutely right. I think that these questions of how do we make meaning in engineering education underpin not just what happens in engineering industry, which I think is really important, it also impacts on what happens in the classroom on a day-to-day basis.
If we think about your work in this space, how would you say it has influenced academics and their approach to engineering education? What is the takeaways from your work, and how does that practically happen in your context?
Thanks, Lalani. I think, so I'd like to speak on two different levels. I think the impact on academics themselves, but then maybe also sort of the implications for curriculum. So I think I'll start with the impact on academics themselves. So I think the first thing is the work of educational development and really engineering education itself, not necessarily the research component, but the idea of engineering education, is that it's built on the presupposition that teaching and learning is important and valuable. And certainly that is the case, and it's widely recognized that that's the case. But unfortunately, often in the way that higher education institutions are structured, and increasingly this is the case, is that research is king. And so increasingly academics are measured on the extent to which they produce research rather than necessarily on the quality of teaching and learning that they enact. And I think that this creates a tension both for people who work in my kind of role, so educational development roles, because you want to encourage good teaching and learning, but sometimes you also know that actually for people to get that next promotion or whatever the case may be, it might be that actually they need to focus on their disciplinary research. Because unfortunately for an engineer to move into an engineering education research space, it requires a lot of time and effort, as anyone who's done that transition, who has undergone that transition will tell you. So I think that creates a tension both for the educational developer, but also for the person themselves, because a lot of people have a real passion for teaching and learning, and they can become quite disillusioned with the system when they're not necessarily able to give their best in terms of teaching and learning, or if they do give their best, and that then is not necessarily recognized. So I think for me, one of the key implications that we need to look at moving forward is how we can better recognize quality teaching and learning in engineering, but also then how we can give greater value to quality teaching and learning. And I think that that's really one of the biggest challenges that I think the engineering education community should be tackling, is how to really put teaching and learning quality back on the agenda. And by quality, I don't mean quality assurance and those kinds of discourses. I mean sort of how do we make good teaching cool, for lack of a better word? And also, how do we make it recognized? How do we recognize good teaching? So I think that's the one level of implication that I think that we need to think about, is the impact on academics for the promotion of teaching and learning. But I also just want to think about like curriculum itself. So if I can just use a practical example of civil engineering, for example, because that's what I'm most familiar with. So if we think about a civil engineering curriculum and the specific practice, for example, of building a road, which is the example I often give. So students would undertake surveying, which is perhaps the first step in building a road, right? So they would do surveying as its own module, right? So that there they would sort of do sort of leveling and those kinds of practices around sort of reading the landscape on which one may want to build this road. Then the process of sort of geometric design would be taught in another module. So the process of actually then designing the layout of the road itself. Then the process of pavement design might be undertaken in another module. Possibly the same module as the geometric design, but possibly not. So that would then be a different module where they would actually look at the design of the road surface itself. Then design as a process might be covered in an entirely different module. And so you can see that when we think about engineering as a meaning-making practice in which people are working with the world and transforming the world into manipulatable representations in the form of diagrams and drawings and so on, that often the ways in which we have designed our curriculum actually work against students making these connections. So I've shown how one practice, that practice of building a road, for example, is covered over a course of at least 4 different modules, and the connections are not necessarily always made for students. And that's just looking at the design process. Once we go into the construction process, then you would have an altogether different module that perhaps looks at construction management, a different module that perhaps looks at project management. So now you're starting to get to 5, 6 modules, all essentially contributing to the same practice, but all quite distilled and isolated from one another in the way that the curriculum is designed. So I think one of the core implications of the work that I've been doing for engineering education is to look at what are we doing in our curricula and how can we better design curricula to surface these broader practices, these meaning-making practices, rather than just distinct content areas.
You talk about curriculum and intent. Amazingly, just before coming for this podcast recording, I was having a conversation with 2 of our postgraduate students who tutor things and their difficult experiences with undergrad students who were using ChatGPT and other LLMs to try and answer specific content questions, with these like bite-sized answers. And the tutor's frustration, because the tutors could see the bigger picture of how these tough questions impacted next week's learning, etc., but how students were experiencing the questions as just, if I give you this answer, you give me my marks and off I go. And how, what you're just saying about when students can't see that big picture, how often they get lost in the weeds and they do things that we get frustrated by. We get very, very frustrated with simply because they just didn't know what did we want them to take away from the question beyond this is how you survey a road. So not less a question, but more something that if I'm sure you've got a view on how AI and LLMs, etc., impact how we think about curricula.
I think, linked to that, what connects for me and what Zach was just sharing is this: the students can't see the bigger picture, and often staff can't see the bigger picture. How many staff has like in-depth knowledge and understanding of the curriculum and how it's put together and what its intent was or is? And you could take that a level up in terms of the university or accreditation bodies or so on, right? So it almost feels like at different levels there's a lack of clarity. And I think the connected to that question around now students are using ChatGPT, I wonder if it connects to what you mentioned earlier, Zach. If there is no space for the students to make those connections, if those connections aren't explicitly built into the curriculum, then everything becomes a tick box. For us, accreditation becomes a tick box as academics. Hitting your research KPIs become a tick box. And so the amount of stuff that we add onto an academic's role and the amount of stuff that we add into a curriculum for the students to then survive almost lead to everyone just racing through and doing more and learning less and getting less. So I don't know, maybe you can answer that in relation to the AI. I don't know if there's a connection that's made for you in between those 2 points.
I think that you're absolutely right in terms of saying that we're doing more, and yet I think we and our students are learning less. I think in the rush to produce research, we are ourselves also not necessarily producing the best quality research that we could be producing. But I think also that in our rush to do more and to produce more research, to teach more students, to supervise more students, to attract more research funding, to do more community engagement, to be more involved with industry and so on, the overall effect of this is that we're not doing anything as well as we could. And I think that this has implications for ourselves and our own well-being, but also then for the well-being of our students and also their learning. And so I think that this is really a problem. Like in my view, higher education is expecting everyone to be everything. And I think that's an unrealistic expectation. And I think that there should be a more focus on people really specializing on something that they're good at. And so there are people that are really good at teaching and learning, and there are people that are singularly terrible at teaching and learning, but are really excellent researchers. And those people should be given the space to do what they're really good at, and should maybe not be forced to do things that they are singularly terrible at. But the challenge then becomes, how can these be equally valued in the space? I think they are equally valued in the sense that everyone's expected to do everything, but maybe we need a more nuanced way of thinking about it. So for me, in terms then of what is this, linking this to the question of AI, I think that AI should be helping both lecturers and students to be more effective in the way that we think about teaching and learning. So I think that AI presents opportunities for us to use AI, not to spend less time teaching, which is often how it's framed, but to actually be more effective in the way that we create learning opportunities for students. So I think that AI can be used very effectively to help students to make those connections. And I think that the lack of time and effort and energy that people have in terms of being overstretched and so on is meaning that the sort of knee-jerk reaction to AI is to sort of either shut it down completely or to just be laissez-faire about it. But actually, if we were more intentional about our use of it, both for us, but then also in the way we enable our students to use it, I think it could actually promote learning on the part of students, but also make our teaching more rewarding and more effective. Initially, it may take more time, but I think if it does save lecturers time, then that's a secondary benefit. But I don't think that's the primary goal for me. The goal is really to think about how we can use it to promote quality learning. And I think it can be used for that purpose.
Well, I think I really like how you framed it, like that the intention of using AI is not necessarily to free up the lecturer's time, but to promote an improvement in the learning. And that's really interesting, because I'm wondering how now AI can do some tasks for us that used to take us longer, and so it's faster and easier. What do we fill that space with that we've now created? Instead of filling that space with more content, more, like you say, papers that maybe could have taken longer or to kind of come to fruition. But can we use that space then perhaps to reflect on our teaching practice, perhaps to think about how we connect with the community of practice? So I think there's a lot of value in reframing that, Zach. So I really like how you've made that distinction, that the intention is not to save us time, the intention is to promote learning. And how does that look? How does that look different rather than us just thinking about, now it's cutting more time off my teaching, to what end? For me to rest as an academic, because we all need rest, for me to produce more papers, to do more work, because I think that's almost the blind spot potentially, to say, like, I'm saving time on this so I can be more productive on that, and not actually saving time for you to rest, and saving time for you to reflect, and saving time for you to consider how that influences the students' learning. I think you've mentioned quite a couple of points in terms of the learning of the student, in terms of the impact of academic development and the curriculum, the complexity around that. And I'm wondering if I had to have a direct question around how your work, and I think let's think about your research, but also your work and practice, then benefits the students when they transition into the workplace. Is there anything that stands out for you in terms of that transition? I think you've mentioned the connection points that we need to create more meaningfully in a curriculum. Is there anything else that stands up for you in terms of that?
Definitely. I think that from a lecturer perspective, I think that we need to think about sort of the ways in which we design curricula and the links that we make for students in the ways that we design curricula. But I also think that we need to think about what it is that we want students to do. So I think that our assessment mechanisms are often quite stale, quite outdated, haven't necessarily moved along with the times, the advances that have been made in terms of technologies such as AI, and also just in terms of who our students are and what they are interested in and what society actually wants our graduates to do. So I think that we really also need to think about that. And I think that in terms of students, that could then have impacts for the ways in which they see themselves in engineering. Because I think a number of students do enter into engineering with a view, however naive, to make an impact on their communities and to I don't know, change the world, for lack of a better word. And I think that often the way in which engineering is framed often stifles that creativity, that desire to be innovative, that desire to contribute to society. And I think that in so doing, we are alienating some students from the engineering profession. So in the first instance, we're struggling to attract some students because of the stereotypical views of engineering. But we're also then, once students are in engineering, we're alienating some of them and then losing them either during the curricula, like in the to other programs or whatever the case may be, or to the institutions completely. Or post-graduation, they are not necessarily staying in the industry and are rather seeking opportunities outside of engineering. And so in some ways, this also relies on engineering industry itself changing and seeing itself as being more than just a technocratic kind of discipline, but actually seeing itself as a discipline that's really rooted in societal needs and that wants to contribute to social development and social progress. But I think our students need to be, and I think engineering is moving in that direction. So I think our students need to be prepared for an industry that is moving in that direction. And I think that will also then benefit a broader range of students. So I would like to see a situation where graduates see themselves being able to thrive in industry, even if they're not necessarily the top math student, even if their primary interest is really, even if they have a profound interest in, for example, communication and sort of I'd like to see a situation in which those kinds of students see themselves in the industry and see themselves in the profession and see themselves as being able to make a contribution.
I wonder if we think about it in terms of a systemic shift, in terms of how we show up in academics and how we think about that identity formation, how our students are then linked to the profession, as well as the profession itself. If there's a different way of thinking about how that looks. And what is set up really well for this is, I think, with the recent revision of the International Engineering Alliance, the documentation that's more closely aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, and as a consequence, of course, has filtered into our own accreditation at ICSA in South Africa. If you look at those and if you interrogate those attributes, even the word attributes is far different and far more complex than just knowledge content. And the identity formation around that kind of complexity of the attribute, and I'm specifically using the complexity, is something that I think we don't create enough time to grapple with. And I almost want to say we don't grapple with it as a collective. It's not just academics needing to grapple with it. It's not just industry that needs to grapple with it, but in relation to each other and including our students, because they're also from a different generation, right? Growing up in in a time where there's a lot of technology and AI components that are now normalized. So I wonder in that, maybe in two parts. Let's be aspirational in terms of what it can become. What can it become if we put these three components together? If we have students and academics and industry reflecting collectively in terms of how does the profession become more broader than it is in terms of who sees itself in that profession. So that is the one component. And maybe as the other component, how do we practically think about doing something like this? I think, yeah, so if those are the aspirational component, like let's dream for a minute, I guess, and then practically what do you think is possible?
Well, firstly, I think that your observation about attributes being themselves very complex and not the same as knowledge content per se, I think is spot on, because our curricula are designed around knowledge, and our curricula, the sort of underpinning design structure of our curricula was done long before there was even such a thing as a graduate attribute in engineering, even before there were exit level outcomes, which were in existence before the graduate attributes. And so our curricula are fundamentally, at a fundamental level, are long overdue for a rethink in terms of the ways in which they design. Their underpinning design principle needs to be rethought, because they are existing currently as they exist. They're designed around knowledge and content. Whereas actually the outcomes or the expected attributes, the GAs that are expected at the end, are all, as you say, they're attributes. They're not necessarily knowledge. And because we've spoken about this before, that my view is always that no one, but specifically not engineers, we don't just say sort of, now I'm communicating, now I'm being ethical, now I'm solving problems. We're doing all of those things all the time when we're doing our day-to-day jobs, engineers and non-engineers alike. That's the way people operate. We are enacting different attributes at any given moment in time all the time. So this idea that we somehow can isolate these attributes, and I know that that's what's expected in terms of accreditation, but it's somewhat artificial. And I think that we, lecturers, our students, and industry, as you are suggesting, do need to collectively think about how can we develop these attributes in a way that we can demonstrate their achievement individually, but also recognize that in the real world, they're not isolated things. They can't be separated from the actual practice of just being a human, really, as you've said in the past. So that's the starting point for me, is how can we collectively understand these attributes as being discrete, but also connected and integrated and so on. So this means that we have to think very differently then about the kinds of curricular practices, but also teaching and learning practices and also assessment practices that we use. And it means that we do have to think a lot more about how real world contexts and real world problems can be brought into the classroom, and how these can inform the types of assessments that we design, and how we can better construct an educational experience that mimics the real world, but also then picks apart the real world. And I think that that's always been one of the challenges that higher education faces, is there's a lot of calls for industry relevance and so on. But it's not just about mimicking industry, but it's about unpacking the real world, and sort of picking apart the different components and sort of understanding what's going on there, rather than simply just expecting that those things will be self-evident to students, that if we just give them a task that requires teamwork, for example, that they will then just be able to enact teamwork. But actually to give them a task that enables, that requires teamwork, but then to also give them the opportunity to unpack what that teamwork entailed, how they functioned as part of a team, how others functioned as part of that team, what made that team successful or not successful. So that sort of metacognitive awareness of these attributes, I think is probably for me the bigger key to success if we're talking about industry relevance. So it's not just about simulating these complex real world problems, but it's then also about unpacking them thereafter. So the simulation, but then the subsequent unpacking, I think is really important. So we're getting them to engage in these multiple competencies, these various attributes, but also getting them to think about them discretely and how they contribute to their meaning making and their knowledge construction, but also their being an engineer individually and in conjunction. That's ideally where we need to get to. Now, practically what that means, I think, is going to require a lot of real thinking. I think there's a lot of potential in projects like, for example, Engineers Without Borders designing for people. Engineering for People Design Challenge, because I think that the impetus behind that is in some respects to identify real world problems, bring engineering knowledge to bear on solving that problem, and then there is an element of unpacking that in terms of which sustainable development goals does that contribute to, which what kinds of attributes can be developed through such a project, and so on. But perhaps there's room for even more of that unpacking in a project like that. I think there's a lot of good practices going on in engineering education. It's about ensuring that those get rolled out more widely and with more intentionality, I think.
Thanks, Zach. That comment you made about teaching people as, or treating our students as whole people. If I think about 20 years ago, there was so much of a sense of, a student was a number on a class list, and that lecturers would kind of actively fend off the, oh, no, don't talk to me about that thing, because it's not I teach this course. You can't possibly ask me about the content that is in the course adjacent to it. And how what you're really calling for is a significant shift in lecturers being able to engage with students both as complete human beings, and realizing that everything we do, whether it's in our educational practice in our universities and higher learning institutes, or when our graduates go out into the working world, everything that we do is connected to and through other people. And that when we lose sight of that, it's when we can find ourselves in difficult things. So thank you so much for sharing a bit about your journey and your insights into the engineering education space, and where things could potentially go in the future. It's been enlightening.
Thank you very much for having me.
And to the listeners, we would like to keep you a little bit up to date with some of the things in the engineering education research community, and there will be some links to some of the things that Zach has done, and the Sottle in the South journal that he'd mentioned, as well as some of the design challenges things, hopefully over there. So thank you for staying with us through the podcast, and we will hopefully have some more for you sooner.